Howdy, folks, and welcome to another episode of the DINO WYO Podcast. Apologies now that this intro is going to be longer than most. In this episode, I'll begin to talk about inflation, what inflation is, what the primary causes of inflation are, and even some of the specific things we can do as a state to bring prices down for working folks. For this video, we decided to do something a little funky and probably not super helpful. We added screenshots from articles on our website, which are linked in the description of this video. These rarely line up with what's being talked about, so they're definitely not as helpful as something like a transcript and might even make it harder to pay attention to what's being said or written. I highly doubt we'll do this again. But we wanted to add them to this video in particular to show that we have been talking about our more specific solutions for a while, especially on the Dino blog at dinowyo.com. A lot of our content that fully dives into these topics and their solutions is going to take a long time to get to, so we wanted you to know that some written versions already exist, though there's more to add there too. If you ever want to get all the way into the weeds, we highly recommend starting with our website, especially the blog category Common Sense Solutions. Mass media content like what we're putting on YouTube is more conceptual and entry-level stuff because it's designed for a very broad audience. The nuance is more at home in our written pieces, where we can get a little bit more in-depth. Frankly, I haven't been able to get nearly as in-depth as I'd like to with any of our content, but especially our videos. Unfortunately, that's just because of how politics and building a movement works. You can't lead with details, you have to start broader. But if you'd ever like to dive all the way in, feel free to reach out to me directly at dinowyo@gmail.com. I'd love to schedule a call or an in-person visit where we can talk everything through in as much detail as you desire. I promise that I have thought a lot of it through, and I know a lot of nerds who have thought a lot more about what needs to change. But I also love learning from regular people who often know more about fixing the problems than the bureaucrats currently benefiting from our broken system. But enough of that. For now, let's begin the next episode of the DINO WYO Podcast, where we can begin to examine the topic of inflation and what Wyoming can do to save our economy from its growing consequences.
There are two primary drivers of inflation in America right now. And if you're not familiar, inflation is where yesterday $1 bought you a soda, and tomorrow $2 buys you a soda, and the day after that $3 buys you a soda, and on and on. And things cost more. Even if you have more money in dollars, you have less spending power. So I talk a lot about this. I talk a lot about spending power. And that's a good measure of the economy, is how much spending power does the average person have. Bad measures of the economy are things like GDP or stock prices. The two drivers of inflation that are decreasing everybody's spending power, making it so that you can buy less with the money you have, are government spending and an out-of-control stock market. So first, on government spending. This should be pretty obvious, but we all know the government thinks a hammer costs $10,000. Imagine if you need to go buy a hammer. The person selling that hammer has, let's just imagine for simplicity's sake, just two people who want to buy that hammer. You and the government. Now, maybe they want to sell it to you. You're like, hey, I'll give you $5 for that hammer. I'll give you $10, whatever. Let's even be crazy. I'll give you $100 for that hammer, which would be outrageous, but maybe it's a really good hammer. I don't know. And then the government says, I'll give you $10,000 for that hammer. Is that business going to sell to you? Probably not. And even if they are, they're probably not going to take as little as $100 for a hammer. They're going to ask you for like $2,000, $5,000, something that matches that government bid. So that's, at a very simple level, the first cause of inflation is that the government is spending too much on simple stuff and way too much on complicated stuff, and it's driving the price up of everything, because they're a competitor in the marketplace. The other cause of inflation is a lot more complicated to talk about, but imagine a stock. A stock is when you own a part of a company and when that company theoretically sends you money in exchange for their own value. So you maybe buy a piece of Netflix. I'm actually going to use Netflix here because they're a perfect example for what I'm talking about. In theory, let's say you spent $1 and you bought one stock, one share of Netflix. They should send you some money every month, every quarter, every year. It's not going to be $1 because it's never the full amount of the stock. It's called a dividend. They'll send you some of it, and over time you would make money, or you might sell it to somebody. You bought it for $1 today, and then somebody else buys it from you for $2 tomorrow, and you made $1. Cool. The problem is, right now, most stock is not bought and sold in that way. Most stocks are bought at a massive level, at a huge level, and so you have somebody who will buy like 5,000 shares of Netflix And the reason they do this is because they know with inflation that stock will be worth more. Now, this is called the buy, borrow, die scam, and it's what the rich people do. So if you're tracking what I'm saying, it should start to sound a little weird, because if you listen to the Reds or the conservatives or the big business folks, they'll tell you that inflation is the government's fault. And if you listen to the blues or the liberals or the lefties or the commies or whatever you want to call them, they'll tell you it's the rich people's fault. And I'm here to tell you it's the rich people and the government's fault. They're both actually right on this. They're just right about half the problem. What rich people do is they buy a lot of assets, stocks, shares, whatever you want to call them, whatever you've heard them called. They buy these things. And sometimes it's not just stocks, it's real estate, it's a lot of stuff. But they borrow against it. So let's say I own $1 million in stocks. What I do is I go to the bank, I borrow $2 million against my $1 million in stock. Why am I able to borrow that much? Well, in part because the bank will assume that I will get more down the line. And sure enough, I do. Tomorrow, those stocks are worth $3 million. So then I borrow $4 million, I pay off my $2 million loan, and now I'm living on debt and I don't pay taxes. And I know some of this is complicated, people. Math is scary, not because it's actually scary, but because the powers that be have tricked you into thinking you're stupid and that you can't do math. And that's a real problem. Anytime you start talking about policy, all the nerds will be like, oh, 1.2864% niner delta Z. And you're like, wait, did I catch a niner in there? Are you calling from a walkie-talkie? And then they just do this to trick you, to pull the wool over your eyes, to make you think it's too complicated. And it's not. You can understand this. The core of what the rich people do is they borrow money, they live on debt, and then eventually they die. And they pass all of their money on to somebody, and it never gets taxed. And because they were living on debt, they never get taxed either. That's why you pay 25% plus of your income every paycheck to the government, and Donald Trump paid $10 in federal income taxes, right? That's why you pay almost half of your money in taxes, and some rich guy like Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos or whoever doesn't pay a dime. It's because they're living on quote-unquote debt. Well, how does this cause inflation? Well, because enough rich people are doing it, and they're all reliant on inflation. Imagine if I had $1 million in stocks, and I borrowed $2 million, and the stocks just stayed at $1 million. Now, if I was living on dividends, like people think stocks work, that would be fine. Or if I was trading them, like people think stocks work, that would be fine, because I would still have $1 million. But that's not fine if I borrowed $2 million, right? So you now need the economy to inflate to make your borrow worth it, to make your bet worth it. So rich people use our system, and they basically hide money in real estate, in stocks, in other assets, in all of these things that make it so they never pay taxes. And then they drive up inflation because it benefits them long run. And why does the government contribute to this? Because the rich people also own the government, right? So this is a self-perpetuating cycle. It's a snake eating its own tail. And what ends up happening is regular working people have less and less money, even if they make more. You might get a raise this year, but if everything costs twice as much as it did last year, that raise doesn't actually matter, right? So how do you fix this? Well, this is why I brought up Netflix earlier. Netflix has literally never made a profit in their existence. Their cost is always more than they take in. That's part of why now they're cracking down on sharing passwords and things like that. They want to maximize their profit because they're finally running up to the end of the line, and stockholders are bailing on them in droves. But despite never being profitable, Netflix has only ever seen its share values increase. That's what happens to a company like Netflix. They keep being worth more, even though they're not actually making more. Or a very good example of this, I was looking at it the other day. You might remember Texas Instrument calculators from when you were kids, when you were in school. Texas Instrument makes calculators. They also make missiles and a lot of other things because they make microprocessors. Texas Instrument has seen revenue and income decline steadily in the past few years. Their equity, which is a word for their total stock valuation, has increased, even though they're making less money. The problem is, in America, what we tax is profit. We say, if you spent $100 and you made $200, we're only going to tax the $100 difference between them. What this means is, if you're a small business owner, or even a reasonable business, you can make $10 million a year. You're probably still getting whacked on your taxes, right? What we need to stop doing is taxing profit because it punishes small business. It goes, ooh, you actually made some money this year? Whack 'em. Whereas a company like Texas Instruments says, we actually didn't make any profit, so we don't get taxed, even though our stocks are worth so much more. And then they reward their CEO with stocks that they can borrow against and assets that they can borrow against. So the rich people have basically another economy on top of ours. And I'm not the best at explaining this. There are other people who have done like animated videos and things like that explaining this exact problem. But I want to give at least a little bit of an overview of it because it's key to understanding a very easy change that we could make that would solve most of the inflation problem. And it would mean that you, the worker, you, the small business owner, you, the ma and pa shop owner, will have more money in your pocket. The change is, instead of taxing profit, we tax revenue. Profit is the difference between what you spend and what you make in a year. Revenue is just what you take in. Now, I want to give a few examples. Imagine you're a business and you make $1 million a year, but you spend like $800,000 or whatever. If we taxed revenue at a very low percentage, it would be an easier to calculate cost than what we currently see in the world. Instead, we tax profit, so that business gets whacked on $200,000, and Netflix says, we didn't make a profit, so we don't pay tax, even though they're a multi-billion-dollar company. Now, what I would like to do is instead of taxing profit, we would tax revenue. We would set a very high threshold for where that taxation begins. I'm talking like $50 million a year. If your business doesn't take in $50 million, we don't tax you. And then you would set that tax at something like 5%. I've talked to a lot of small business owners. They love this, even if they were getting taxed, because instead of having to pay an accountant as much as they currently do to hide profits, they would just know what their cost is. On the flip side, companies like McDonald's, it would make sense for them to continue to operate at the scale they do, but other companies that currently have massive revenue and show no profit wouldn't keep doing that. What's an example of this? Pfizer, the vaccine company, is one of the biggest purchasers of music rights and movie rights in America. Why? Well, they buy unprofitable records and they buy unprofitable movies because they can write it off on their taxes and they can later take in revenue from that movie in 30 years as it continues to accumulate money. I guess the core of what I'm saying is, right now there are two economies. There is the real economy where you and I live, where we spend money, where we make money through a paycheck and we get taxed on that and it's bullshit. We get whacked. Everything costs more even though it's going down in quality. Your bag of chips has fewer chips in it even though it costs more. Your car runs for fewer miles even though it costs more. Your washing machine breaks down in a year. Your new dishwasher breaks down in a year. Life hack. If you want a fridge that works after you buy your new one, hold on to your old one because in 2 years when your new one breaks, the old one will still work, right? That's the problem. We all live in that economy. And then rich people live in a totally different economy where none of their money is real. It all exists as imaginary numbers on a screen, and they get to buy anything they want with it at the same time as they drive up our prices. So I'm going to fix that.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the DINO WYO Podcast. We will have a lot more content coming out later about fixing our broken economy, but we hope that this served as a good sample of what's to come. It's a total departure from the red-blue split, focused on doing what actually works for working people, not for the billionaire donor class that controls our system and our politics. For more insights into the Dino movement and our vision about fixing the mess we've gotten ourselves into, be sure to like, subscribe, and all that other jazz to all of our assorted channels. Be especially sure to check out our blog at dinowyo.com, where we get a little bit more into the weeds than feels appropriate for these videos, at least so far. As always, if you have questions or want to talk about this more in depth, reach out to dinowyo@gmail.com or feel free to comment on our website using the comment form at the end of every one of our pages and blog posts. For now, this is Gabriel Green, Dino candidate for Wyoming governor in 2026, and I'll see you next time.